What if ancient Egypt conquered Europe? What if Ramses the Great hadn't simply looked eastward toward the fading Hittite Empire, but instead turned his gaze to the unknown lands across the sea? What if, rather than building temples for eternity, the pharaoh had launched an empire destined to eclipse time itself, an empire stretching not just along the Nile, but across the whole of Europe? The history we know remembers Egypt as a colossus of stone and ritual, an ancient civilization obsessed with order, harmony, and the afterlife. It built pyramids to last forever, etched its kings into immortality, and rarely dared to look beyond its sacred deserts. For nearly 3 millennia, Egypt flourished, but mostly within its borders. Its reach extended into Nubia, Canaan, even parts of Syria. But it never sought to dominate the world the way Rome later would. Egypt, in a sense, was content. But contentment is not inevitability. History is not fixed. Change one decision, one ambition, one war, and the course of civilization bends. So, imagine this. The year is 1274 BCE. Ramses II, already a god among men, is fresh from the Battle of Kadesh, a brutal but inconclusive clash with the Hittite Empire. In our world, Ramses chose diplomacy. He signed the world's first known peace treaty, consolidating his holdings in the Levant and turning his focus inward, building monuments to his glory. But what if he hadn't? What if instead, Ramses read the battle differently? What if he saw not stalemate, but weakness, cracks in the Hittite war machine? In this alternate timeline, Ramses presses forward. Rather than suing for peace, he launches a second campaign, this time deeper, bolder. His armies sweep into Anatolia, and by 1270 BCE, the Hittite capital of Hattusa is in flames. The rival empire collapses under Egyptian iron and fire. In the chaos, Ramses does not stop. He seizes the Hittite fleet, incorporates Anatolian engineers, and claims the Aegean as his next prize. The Phoenicians, master shipbuilders and cautious traders, now face a simple choice: resist and burn, or submit and profit. They choose wisely. In exchange for autonomy, their fleets become Pharaoh's navy. For the first time in history, Egypt becomes truly maritime. And then, the Great Leap. By 1265 BCE, Egyptian ships set sail across the Aegean Sea. The islands of the Cyclades fall swiftly. Mycenaean citadels, those high-walled fortresses immortalized by Homer, crack under the weight of chariot-riding Egyptian soldiers. The Greeks, still living in a pre-classical Bronze Age world, are no match for the discipline, strategy, and scale of Ramses' empire. Athens, barely a town, is taken in days. Crete, once home of the great Minoan civilization, is already a shadow of itself and folds easily into Egyptian rule. But this is more than conquest. Ramses is not just a warrior, he is a builder of worlds. He establishes administrative hubs in Knossos, Corinth, and Ephesus. Egyptian scribes begin recording Mediterranean languages. Temples to Amun and Ra rise alongside ruined Mycenaean palaces. The fusion begins. Culturally, politically, the ancient Greek world starts to reflect the glow of the Nile. To maintain control, Ramses commissions a new city, Per Amun Europa, the House of Amun in Europe, located on the coast of modern-day western Anatolia. From here, his governors oversee the new Egyptian provinces. Grain, gold, cedar, and bronze flow back to Thebes. In return, Europe receives order: architecture, language, religion, administration. But every great empire plants the seeds of rebellion alongside its banners. Far to the west, beyond even Egyptian maps, lies a series of hilly villages, forests, and untamed tribes. In one of them, a tiny settlement along the Tiber River begins to stir. It is poor, insignificant, but not for long. The place is called Roma, and it has just noticed the shadow stretching over the sea. By the dawn of the 12th century BCE, the Mediterranean no longer belonged to chance. It belonged to Egypt. From the marshes of the Nile Delta to the rocky shores of Attica, Pharaoh's seal marked stone, scroll, and sea. Greek lords, once kings of their high-walled citadels, were now provincial governors answering to Thebes. The language of command was demotic, the symbol of rule, not the olive branch, but the golden ankh. This Egyptian Europe was not one of chaos, but of calculated design. Ramses' successors, first Merneptah, then Seti II, understood that conquest alone could not hold a continent. Integration was essential, so they set about the greatest administrative experiment in early human history. In Athens, Egyptian engineers built irrigation systems that channeled mountain springs through canals inspired by the Nile. In Knossos, the ruins of Minoan palaces were retrofitted into temples of Amun. And in Delphi, once a sacred Greek site, a new oracle emerged, one who wore linen instead of wool and channeled not Apollo, but Thoth, god of wisdom. Over time, a cultural fusion began to harden into something new. Greek artisans carved sphinxes with Hellenic faces. Egyptian priests held court in marble amphitheaters. The pantheon blurred. Ra merged with Helios, Isis with Demeter. Even burial customs shifted. Elite Greeks were now embalmed, buried in rock-cut tombs beneath what had once been olive groves, their souls sailing westward not to Hades, but to the field of reeds. But beneath this golden veneer, resistance simmered. Among the hills of central Italy, outside the Egyptian sphere of control, independent tribes watched and waited. The Etruscans, fierce and cunning, traded with Egyptian ports but never bowed. The Latins, smaller and scattered, maintained their hilltop villages in silence. But they watched as Egyptian patrols crossed the straits into Sicily, as hieroglyphs appeared on coins, as foreign temples rose on sacred ground. And they remembered. In the shadow of this empire, a secret alliance began to form. A loose confederation of Attalic clans, united not by ambition, but by fear. Their gatherings were primitive compared to the opulence of Thebes, but their purpose was clear. Resist Pharaoh. They spoke of a dream, a city that would stand not under the rule of the gods, but under the will of men. A city forged from stone, iron, and rebellion. Roma, once a nameless outpost, became that dream's heart. At first, its defiance was small: refusal to pay tribute, sheltering of escaped slaves, sabotage of Egyptian supply routes. But every act lit another flame. Egyptian satraps in southern Italy reported strange symbols carved into trees: a she-wolf, a sword, a river. Warnings, prophecies. The pharaoh of the time, Seti II, saw the signs. He dispatched a seasoned general, Panesi of Thebes, with a full legion across the Adriatic. His orders: extinguish the embers before they became fire. But what Egypt found in Italy was unlike anything they had faced before. The terrain was brutal: steep ridges, dense forests, unfamiliar weather. The Egyptians, masters of desert warfare and open field tactics, found their chariots bogged down in mud and narrow passes. The Latin warriors struck from hidden trails, vanishing before counterattacks could form. They fought not for territory, but for memory, for an identity that had never known conquest. The Egyptian legions suffered losses, retreated, regrouped. But the damage was done. The myth of Egyptian invincibility had cracked. And in Roma, that single crack was enough. From the ashes of resistance, a leader emerged. His name was Cerinus. Born of a Latin mother and an Egyptian scribe father, he knew both worlds, spoke both tongues, and swore allegiance to neither. Trained in Egyptian military academies, but raised on Italic soil, Cerinus understood something the pharaohs did not: that fire cannot be conquered with stone. And he was preparing something bold: not rebellion, revolution. He called it liberatio, not just a war for land, but for memory, for the right to exist outside the shadow of the gods. Cerinus was not like the warlords before him. He did not see Egypt as a tyrant, but as a mirror, a civilization of majesty and chains. He admired their roads, their organization, their architecture. But he also understood their weakness. They ruled by ritual, not adaptation. Their armies were trained for flat plains and divine order, not guerrilla ambushes, winter hardship, or defiant men with nothing to lose. So he forged something new. Under his command, the Latin tribes were unified for the first time, not under monarchy, but under oath. A confederation bound by shared language, shared grievance, and a single purpose: to drive Pharaoh back across the sea. He trained his soldiers not in grand parade formations, but in small, fast-moving units. They learned to strike quickly, disappear into the forests, survive on little, and use the terrain like a second weapon. In 1047 BCE, the first major confrontation arrived. Panesi, having returned from his failed incursion, convinced the pharaoh to authorize a second campaign, larger, more brutal. 3 legions of Egyptian soldiers, nearly 18,000 men, landed near modern-day Naples. They brought siege equipment, horses, engineers. They built roads as they advanced, temples as they camped. Egypt would not simply conquer, it would civilize. But Cyrannus had no intention of meeting them head-on. Instead, he cut off their lines, raided their supply caravans, spread false intelligence, lured scouts into traps, poisoned wells. He understood that every Egyptian soldier killed was not just a military loss, but a blow to a belief system that demanded divine order. The gods, it seemed, were not protecting their children. After nearly a year of attrition, the Egyptians began to retreat, not in defeat, but in doubt. And in that moment, Cyrannus struck. In a surprise night assault outside the fortress city of Capua, he ambushed the heart of the Egyptian force. The battle was chaos: burning siege towers, shattered chariots, screams in both Latin and Demotic. The Nile banners fell, and in the blood-soaked mud, Panesi was slain. His death echoed all the way back to Thebes. For the first time in generations, an Egyptian general had been defeated on foreign soil. The shock rippled through the empire. Governors in Anatolia demanded reinforcements. Provinces in Greece began murmuring about autonomy. Even the Phoenician allies grew restless. The illusion of permanence, the belief that Egypt's rule was as eternal as its pyramids, had cracked once more. Back in Italy, Cyrannus capitalized on the momentum. He proclaimed the birth of a new republic, not a kingdom, not a divine monarchy, but a senate of tribes, one that would learn from Egypt's systems but reject its divine hierarchies. Temples were rebuilt, not for gods, but for history. Statues of Ra and Horus were torn down, replaced with wolf emblems and laurels. Roma was no longer a dream, it was now a force. Egypt, faced with growing instability across its European holdings, had a decision to make: retaliate with overwhelming force, or consolidate what remained. The pharaoh at the time, Setnecht, an aging but pragmatic ruler, chose the latter. He recalled his legions to Greece and the Aegean coast. Italy, he declared, was too wild to civilize. Let it burn itself out. But he underestimated the flame he left behind. Roma began to rise, slowly, deliberately, with Egyptian engineering knowledge but Italic defiance. It built aqueducts based on Nile models, created bureaucracies patterned after the temples of Memphis, but infused them with republican ideals. Its scribes learned to write in both alphabets, its soldiers trained in both worlds, and its memory, etched in fire and rebellion, never forgot who had once tried to chain it. Meanwhile, across the eastern Mediterranean, other cities watched with interest. In Athens, now an Egyptian satrapy, students gathered in secret courtyards to hear tales of Cyrannus. In Ephesus, soldiers questioned their loyalty. And in Delphi, the new oracle began giving answers the priests of Amun did not approve of. The Nile had crossed the sea. But the sea, it seemed, was pushing back. And far to the west, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, another power was watching, a city built by merchants, untouched by Pharaoh's hand, beginning to whisper a name of its own: Carthago. To the Egyptians, Carthage was a curiosity, little more than a Phoenician trading colony nestled against the North African coast, too distant and too mercantile to pose any real threat. But the pharaohs had grown complacent, distracted by revolts, by the complexities of ruling 2 continents, and by the creeping stagnation of an empire that now extended farther than the gods had ever envisioned. In contrast, Carthage thrived in the margins. Founded by Tyrian exiles decades earlier, it had learned from both East and West. It borrowed Egyptian building techniques, adapted Greek maritime innovations, and studied the growing Roman resistance with cautious admiration. The city lacked Egypt's grandeur, but it possessed something more dangerous: hunger. Carthage began quietly. It expanded its harbors, trained its navy, fortified its granaries. It sent scouts, not priests, to the Italian coast. And what they found there shook them. A fire had been lit. Roma, once a resistance, was now a republic in motion. Its Senate debated war strategy. Its roads stretched to the Apennines. Its legions bore shields marked not by gods, but by wolves. The Carthaginians saw opportunity. In 1025 BCE, envoys from Carthage arrived in Roma, cloaked and cautious. They offered grain, iron, shipwrights. In return, they asked only one thing: alliance. Serenus, now an aging figure with iron in his hair and scars across his chest, considered the offer carefully. Carthage was foreign, yes, but it was not Pharaoh. And the time for isolation had ended. If Egypt were to be pushed back entirely, it would take more than Latin fury. It would take strategy, coordination, trade. The alliance was struck, an unholy union. Some whispered, between sea and soil. But it worked. Within a decade, the balance of power shifted again. Carthaginian fleets patrolled the Tyrrhenian Sea, disrupting Egyptian merchant routes. Roman engineers, aided by Carthaginian funds, began constructing fortified roads and outposts along the Greek coast. And in the port city of Taras, once an Egyptian stronghold, a combined force of Romans and Carthaginians launched a full assault, burning the Temple of Ra, capturing the garrison, and raising a new banner, one of united defiance. Back in Thebes, the pharaoh Ramesses IV faced a dilemma no ancestor had foreseen. Europe was slipping, not through grand battles or divine wrath, but through erosion. Resistance had become governance. The temples of Amun now stood beside marketplaces where Latin was spoken, and taxes were counted in republican coin. Even the priests began whispering doubts. Had Ma'at, the divine order, been broken? Was it time to retreat and preserve what remained of the Nile's legacy? But there was one voice in the court that called for war. Prince Kayemwaset, son of Ramesses IV, priest scholar and military reformer, believed that the empire had grown soft, that Egypt must reforge itself in iron or vanish beneath history's tide. He demanded a new campaign, not of defense, but total domination. His plan was bold, ruthless, and unprecedented. He called it Operation Horizon. Its goal: recapture Greece, subdue Italia, and extinguish Roma once and for all. Kayemwaset, unlike his forebears, was not blinded by ancient pride. He studied his enemies. He knew their weaknesses. He commissioned new weapons: shorter swords for close combat, composite bows suited for mountain warfare. He introduced reforms, drilled troops year-round, and for the first time in Egyptian history, established winter barracks in Thrace. The Egyptian war machine was awakening. In 1012 BCE, under the light of a full moon, 200 ships departed from Alexandria Precursor. They carried 25,000 men, soldiers, engineers, scribes, priests, and orders carved in obsidian. The Republic must fall. But Serenus had planned for this too. He knew that Rome could not face the full weight of Egypt alone, not yet. So he turned to culture as weapon. He sent emissaries to Athens, Corinth, even Delphi, cities still nominally under Egyptian control, but now restless under distant rule. These emissaries carried no swords, only stories. Tales of freedom, of equality, of a city where men ruled themselves, not by birth or divine right, but by merit and vote. It worked. In Athens, students began protesting in the streets. In Thebes, Greece, Egyptian satraps were assaulted. In Delphi, the oracle refused to speak the name of Pharaoh. The spiritual rebellion had begun. And Kayamwaset, as his armies landed on Greek shores, found himself marching not into tribute, but into treachery. The gods were watching, but this time they would remain silent. The Egyptian war fleet reached the Aegean not with thunder, but with silence. Kayamwaset had learned the old ways were no longer sufficient. Parades of golden chariots and proclamations of divine rule meant little to a land now whispering of liberty. So he landed his legions in silence under cover of fog, seizing key ports on the Peloponnesian coast with surgical precision. His men did not build temples, but blockades. No hymns were sung, only the hiss of sharpened bronze. But Europe was no longer the same continent the pharaohs once marched upon. The revolt had not only changed Rome, it had changed the very idea of power. In Athens, citizens met in open assembly beneath statues once meant to honor Ra. They debated war, peace, trade, things once unthinkable under divine kingship. Word of Kayamwaset's landing spread quickly, carried by merchants, fishermen, and students. And where Egypt once inspired awe, it now provoked strategy. Serenus, now near 70, convened the Roman Senate for one final address. He stood beneath the Capitoline wolf, now carved from black marble, its eyes set with amber, and declared a new war not just for territory, but for time itself. If Egypt wins, he said, the future belongs to the past. If we prevail, the past becomes prologue, and the future will be ours to write. He handed command to his adopted son, Tiberius Livius, a young general educated in both Roman law and Egyptian mathematics. Livius had been raised in both traditions, but belonged to neither. He understood Kayamwaset's mind, having studied under the same priest scholars. This was no longer a war of swords. It was a duel of ideas, of systems. Livius's strategy was bold. He would not meet Egypt in Greece, but in the waters between. He knew that for all of Egypt's land power, its navy, though vast, lacked flexibility. Carthaginian admirals had trained his men in curved ramming ships, fast maneuvers, and fire-based weaponry unknown to the Egyptians. At night, Carthaginian saboteurs slipped into Egyptian-occupied harbors, setting vessels ablaze, cutting ropes, poisoning grain supplies. The sea became a battlefield with no front lines. In 1011 BCE, the largest naval battle in Mediterranean history erupted off the coast of Euboea. Over 300 ships clashed under a blood-orange sky. Egyptian triremes, heavy and gold-trimmed, moved with the force of empire, but they were too slow. The Carthaginian Roman fleet, built for speed and maneuver, struck like knives. Flaming pitch was hurled onto wooden decks, sailcloth ignited, screams echoed between the waves. By nightfall, nearly half of Kayamwaset's navy was sunk. But the pharaoh's son was not finished. He regrouped his surviving forces inland, fortified Delphi and Thebes, Greece, and sent a chilling proclamation across all of Egypt's provinces. The gods test us, not for punishment, but for purpose. The Nile has not receded, it has redirected. In this, Kayamwaset showed his genius. Rather than returning to the old model of occupation, he adapted. He declared a new order, a hybrid system of rule combining Egyptian hierarchy with local autonomy. Greek leaders who pledged loyalty were made satraps. Temples were no longer overseen solely by Egyptian priests, but shared with local cults. Taxes were lightened. Philosophers were invited to Thebes to debate, not to be silenced. It was a gamble. Transform the empire before it collapsed. And for a time, it worked. Athens quieted. Ephesus reopened its gates. Even parts of Rome considered negotiation. But revolutions are rarely extinguished by diplomacy alone. Back in Roma, Tiberius Livius saw through the strategy. Kayamwaset does not bring peace, he warned the Senate. He brings sedation. He argued that the new order was not a compromise, but a creeping recolonization masked intolerance. First he shares temples, then laws, then bloodlines, and by the time the wolf realizes it, the leash has already been tied. The Senate agreed. War must continue, but Serenus, watching from the Palatine Hill as smoke curled from distant beacons, knew this would not be a war of generations. It would be decided soon. The tide had turned, and the next blow would be the decisive one. So he summoned the last piece of Rome's resistance, a secret that had waited decades. Not a weapon, not a general, but a language. For centuries, Egypt had ruled not just with armies, but with language. Hieroglyphs were more than writing. They were power. Sacred, encoded, divine. Only priests and scribes could interpret them fully, and that monopoly gave the pharaohs control not only over communication, but over memory itself. To write was to declare truth. To record was to choose what would live beyond time. But Rome had learned. In the early days of rebellion, while swords clashed and temples burned, a small circle of Latin scholars, refugees from conquered cities, former scribes trained in Egyptian schools, had been working in secret. Their task, to create a script not for the gods, but for the people. A language simple enough for soldiers, farmers, and merchants. A system that could travel faster than the Egyptian priesthood, one that could carry ideas beyond borders. They called it Scriptura Libera, the free script. It combined phonetic Latin roots with Egyptian ideograms, stripped of divine exclusivity. It was fast to write, faster to teach. And in the shadow of Rome's rebellion, it spread like fire across the continent. By the time Kayamwaset launched his New Order, this script was already circulating among Greek students, Carthaginian traders, and rebellious satraps. Pamphlets appeared overnight in Corinth. No king is divine who fears debate. In Delphi, let the gods speak, but let the people choose. In Roma, the Nile built pyramids. We will build the future. Kayamwaset was furious. He banned the script, declared it heretical, ordered any stone, papyrus, or inscription bearing its letters to be destroyed. But it was too late. The people had tasted a new kind of literacy, one not given from above, but shared from below. Language had become revolution. Back in Rome, Tiberius Livius understood the moment. He began publishing decrees not only in official Latin, but in Scriptura Libera, military orders, laws, poems, even coded messages for resistance cells across the Aegean. The script, flexible and fast, turned every citizen into a carrier of information, every wall into a printing press. Culture became weaponized. Identity became portable. And Egypt could not keep up. In 10,009 BCE, a massive slave revolt erupted in the province of Crete, sparked by a single sentence scrawled on a temple gate: "The gods do not own the breath of men." Egyptian reinforcements, delayed by winter storms and scattered logistics, arrived too late. The entire satrapy declared independence, joining the Roman alliance and sending ships to the central Mediterranean. Kayamwaset responded with severity. He executed rebellious governors. He reimposed religious law. He ordered a massive fortress to be constructed in Delphi, declaring it the new Eye of Ra in Europa. But as the walls rose, so too did the whispers of betrayal. Egyptian officers were caught selling arms to Roman agents. A priest defected to Athens. A scribe was found dead in Thebes, with the free script carved into his chest. The Nile, once a river of order, had become a delta of doubt. Meanwhile, Carthage moved silently in the background. While Rome and Egypt bled in the open, the Phoenician city built alliances with breakaway Greek islands, offered protection to rebellious ports, and expanded its influence along the African coast. In Sicily, Carthaginian merchants brokered peace between Latin legions and local Egyptian garrisons, only to absorb both. Tiberius Livius saw what was happening. Carthage had joined Rome to break Pharaoh's grip, but now it moved like a shadow, collecting the pieces of a shattered empire. He convened the Senate and proposed the unthinkable. Not total war, but a summit. Held in neutral Sardinia, the summit would bring together Rome, Carthage, and the remaining loyalist Egyptian provinces. Its purpose, not peace, but reckoning. Lines would be drawn, borders agreed, and history, perhaps for the first time, written by more than one hand. Many in the Senate balked, but Serenus, on his deathbed, sent a final message. Victory is not the absence of enemies, but the presence of choices. Go. And so, in the year 1007 BCE, as the snows melted across the Alps and Egyptian ships anchored warily off Athenian ports, Rome proposed dialogue. Not surrender, not submission, but something the ancient world had never truly known: balance. The Sardinian summit of 1007 BCE would later be remembered as the day the ancient world stood still. Three powers, each forged from blood, stone, and ambition, arrived under separate banners, but shared silence. The Roman delegation, led by Tiberius Livius, wore no royal insignia, only laurel bands and linen cloaks. The Carthaginians arrived cloaked in indigo and trade-weighted silk, speaking in hushed tones with eyes on every map. And the Egyptians came last, disembarking in full regalia, gold-inlaid chariots gleaming even in the overcast dawn. At their head was not Pharaoh himself, but Kayemwaset, prince of the Nile and general of the empire. No swords were drawn, but none were sheathed either. The summit convened within a former Nuragic fortress, its stone halls older than any of their civilizations, as if history itself watched with breath held. Over 7 days, they argued, debated, threatened, and retreated. Carthage offered neutrality in exchange for open ports. Rome demanded recognition of its sovereignty. Egypt, still proud, refused to call any rebel a republic. Kayemwaset, seated beneath a carved stone lion, spoke slowly but with fire. "You do not understand what you ask," he warned. "When you sever your memory from the gods, you untether yourself from truth. We are not conquerors. We are continuity." Tiberius responded without raising his voice. Continuity built pyramids, but it did not prevent collapse. What you call truth, we call silence. The room fell quiet. Even the Carthaginians paused. On the final day, no treaty was signed. But something far more dangerous was agreed. A pause. A single season, 90 days, no naval engagements, no land advances. An armistice, not peace. Each faction would use the time to regroup, but beneath the surface, each also knew the same truth. The war was not over. It was only evolving. Back in Thebes, Kayemwaset was hailed as a diplomat, but he knew better. He returned not to rest, but to prepare. The summit had bought him time, but it also revealed Egypt's waning grasp. Too many satrapies questioned orders. Too many temples now whispered the free script behind sacred doors. Even the Nile itself seemed to retreat more each year, as if echoing the doubts in Pharaoh's own court. So he ordered a transformation. Kayemwaset convened the High Temple Council and announced a religious reform, one that would have been unthinkable a generation before. He declared that the gods did not belong to Egypt alone, that Ra, Isis, Thoth, they were not just Egyptian deities, but universal forces. They exist, he said, not in the stones of temples, but in the actions of men. This was not humility, it was strategy. By decentralizing divine authority, Kayemwaset sought to reclaim cultural influence. He dispatched philosopher priests to Athens, to Cyprus, even to Roma, bearing scrolls that blended theology and science, astronomy, medicine, law. In many cities, people welcomed them. After all, these were not conquerors. They were teachers. And for a fleeting moment, it seemed the tides were turning. Young Romans attended Egyptian lectures. Carthaginian traders adopted Nile calendars. In Ephesus, a new school of harmonic law blended Egyptian ethics with Greek logic, teaching that justice flowed, like the Nile, toward balance. But Tiberius Livius was not fooled. To him, this wasn't peace. It was a quieter invasion. Ideas, he knew, could outlast armies. So he responded with his own revolution, not of weapons or walls, but of cities. Rome began founding coloniae, settlements built on its own terms, blending Latin architecture with Egyptian engineering, but under republican rule. These cities, strategically placed along trade routes and former battlegrounds, became anchors of influence. Multilingual, multicultural, but unmistakably Roman. One such city, Concordia Nova, rose near the ruins of ancient Mycenae. Built in concentric tiers, it was designed to symbolize the fusion of order and freedom. Egyptian engineers built aqueducts, Greek artisans carved statues of wolf goddesses, and ibis scholars standing side by side. Carthaginian shipwrights opened docks, but the Senate oversaw it all. In just 2 years, Concordia Nova grew from concept to capital, a lighthouse for the post-imperial world. Refugees from collapsing satrapies arrived daily. Philosophers held debates in open forums. Children were taught in 3 scripts: Latin, Phoenician, and free. And Kayem saw it. From afar, watching reports trickle in, he realized Rome had outmaneuvered him, not through war, but through narrative. They had made themselves not just an army, but a future. And so, he made a final decision. If Egypt could no longer rule through memory, it would rule through the fire. Kayem had offered diplomacy, he had offered reform, philosophy, even theological compromise. But none of it had bent the arc of history back toward Thebes. His priests whispered that Ma'at, the sacred order, was crumbling. His generals asked for more men. His scribes no longer believed their own scrolls. So he chose war. Not as his fathers had waged it, with long marches and proclamations carved in limestone, but with something far older. Something Egypt had not dared to invoke since the Hyksos invasion, the total mobilization of the divine state. They called it the cleansing. In the spring of 10,005 BCE, as grain sprouted along the Upper Nile and the sky turned gold over Luxor, Kayem enacted the decree of Sekhmet. In ritual, Sekhmet was the lioness, the bringer of plague, fury, and balance. But in strategy, she became something else, the emblem of vengeance. Under this decree, every temple in the empire contributed resources. Every able-bodied citizen was either conscripted or taxed double, and every satrapy was ordered to supply ships, grain, and labor, or face religious condemnation. From Memphis to Miletus, the old empire roared awake. A new army was forged, not ceremonial, not symbolic, but practical. Iron-reinforced chariots replaced bronze. Scaled armor was issued to frontline troops. A new class of storm infantry, trained in siegecraft and brutal hand-to-hand combat, was formed, and behind them, rows of engineers and scribes carried maps, ballistae, and fire. But it wasn't just the weapons that changed. It was the tone. The gods were no longer invoked in soft chants, but in war cries. Propaganda painted the Roman script as the tongue of serpents, and Carthaginian merchants as leeches of Maat. Massive granite stelae were erected across the empire, depicting wolves being devoured by cobras beneath the sun disk. This was no longer a war to reclaim territory. It was a crusade. Rome, meanwhile, prepared not with fear, but precision. Tiberius Livius had anticipated this final escalation. His spies in Alexandria Precursor had already reported the decree's passage. Carthage had confirmed fleet movements along the eastern Mediterranean, and most importantly, rebellions in formerly loyal provinces had ceased, not out of fear but calculation. Everyone knew what was coming. A reckoning. So Rome fortified. The city itself was reshaped, walls expanded, aqueducts reinforced, food stocks stored in subterranean chambers. Defensive legions were placed in layers around key cities, not just to fight, but to absorb and stall. Delay became strategy. Rome could not match the numbers of Egypt's holy legions, but it could stretch them, bleed them, scatter them across forests and mountains and marshland. More radically, Tiberius made a move that shocked even his Senate allies. He offered freedom to any Egyptian soldier who defected. In public squares across Europe, proclamations were nailed in every dialect. Lay down your blade and become a citizen. Rome forgets the chains of your past. Join us and help build what Pharaoh cannot imagine. And they came, first in trickles, then in currents. Disillusioned conscripts, Canaanite auxiliaries, even priests who no longer believed. Rome built camps for them, offered them lodging, even allowed them to send word back to families. It was not mercy, it was psychological siege. But Kayemwaset had committed too far. In the summer of 1004 BCE, the final invasion began. It started not with a fleet, but with the burning of Concordia Nova. The Egyptian navy, larger than any assembled in over a century, swept into the Peloponnesian harbors with fireships and siege barges. Concordia Nova, beacon of Roman pluralism, was encircled, bombarded, and set alight. Its libraries crackled in the night. Its statues fell. Survivors were branded with the Eye of Ra and chained. Kayemwaset made a single public statement. "We have burned your future. You will return to your past." The message was clear. This was no longer a war of borders. It was existential. And yet, something shifted. The world did not recoil in awe. It recoiled in horror. The raising of Concordia Nova, once a symbol of unity, sparked something Kayemwaset did not anticipate: empathy. In Athens, students took to the streets. In Phoenician Byblos, merchant guilds voted to suspend grain shipments to Egypt. Even in Memphis, unrest stirred as food prices soared, and sons failed to return. The cleansing had overreached. Rome, bloodied but not broken, responded in kind. Tiberius gave a final address on the Senate floor. "They believe we have no gods because we do not wear them in gold. But our God is not carved in stone. It is the dream that people can govern themselves, and it does not burn." Across Europe, new alliances formed. Tribes once hostile to each other now sent banners to Rome. Colonies once neutral sent ships. Even Carthage, ever the opportunist, publicly condemned the razing and sent engineers to rebuild the smoldering city. Kayemwaset had ignited a fire, but he no longer controlled where it would burn. The empire that once ruled by monuments now found itself trapped by momentum. Kayemwaset's cleansing had been meant as a final blow, a reminder to the world that Egypt did not retreat, that its gods still demanded order, that fire could still impose silence, but instead of fear, it had summoned fury. Concordia Nova's ruins smoldered not just in stone, but in memory. It had become a martyr, a symbol, and symbols, unlike cities, do not fall. In the wake of the massacre, the balance of power tilted irreversibly. Carthage, once cautious and mercantile, moved from ally to avenger. Its Senate, after years of maneuvering in the shadows, openly declared war on Egypt. Their fleets, sleek, fast, and now experienced, closed the central Mediterranean. Egyptian grain ships were intercepted, outposts blockaded. Naval superiority, once assumed by Pharaoh's admirals, was shattered in a matter of months. Tiberius Livius, now de facto ruler of Rome, understood the gravity of the moment. He called it the long dusk, the moment before nightfall, when even dying empires burn brightest. Egypt would not surrender. It would collapse or consume everything in its descent. So Rome prepared its boldest plan yet. Operation Janiculum, named after the hill west of the Tiber, was not a battle plan, but a vision. It sought not merely to defend, but to supplant. If Egypt could not be defeated militarily, then it would be replaced culturally, structurally, spiritually, one province at a time. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Rome would not destroy Egyptian temples. It would repurpose them, not as symbols of rebellion, but as schools. In liberated cities like Knossos and Syracuse, temples once dedicated to Ra were converted into academies. The free script was painted over hieroglyphic carvings, not in mockery, but in translation. Roman engineers mapped out Egypt's ancient irrigation techniques and adapted them for alpine valleys. Even embalming, long a symbol of Pharaoh's monopoly over the afterlife, was reinterpreted as medical science, not sacred rite. In this new world, knowledge no longer belonged to priests. It belonged to citizens. At first, the plan shocked even Rome's allies. To absorb Egyptian forms rather than erase them? Heresy, some said. Dangerous mimicry, said others. But Tiberius understood the lesson empires often forgot. You do not fight monuments with fire. you fight them with meaning. Meanwhile, in Thebes, Khayyam watched his empire hollow from within. Despite his reforms, Egypt's European provinces were no longer just rebellious, they were redefining themselves. Governors began issuing dual decrees in both demotic and free script. Taxes were collected by local councils, not royal scribes. Even priests now taught both the old myths and new civic philosophies. The structure still stood, but its soul had drifted westward. He summoned his last loyal general, Nektep, a Nubian-born warrior raised in the inner sanctums of Memphis, brutal, brilliant, and loyal only to the throne. His command? End this experiment, end their language, end their fire. And so Nektep marched, but not across Greece. He sailed straight for the source, Rome. His armada was smaller than Khayyam earlier invasions, but faster, more disciplined. Nektep understood that victory would not come from reclaiming lost provinces. He needed to strike the heart, break the republic, burn the Senate, shatter the myth. In the winter of 1003 BCE, Nektep landed near Ostia, Rome's key port. The attack was surgical, swift. Roman legions scrambled. Tiberius, caught in the forum during the first strike, refused to flee. Instead, he ordered the evacuation of the archives, the Senate library, and the families of scholars. If the city must fall, he said, let the flame carry memory, not fear. For 3 days, Rome became a battlefield. Fires raged along the Tiber, statues toppled. The Pantheon of Reason, a structure newly built to honor thinkers from all corners of the Alliance, collapsed beneath siege rocks. But the people did not run. Women joined fire brigades. Former Egyptian defectors held the northern gates. Children carried water. Every citizen became resistance. On the 4th day, as Nektep's forces advanced toward the Capitoline Hill, a signal fire appeared on the western ridge. It was Carthage. 3 fleets, led by Admiral Hanno the Younger, had slipped past Egypt's blockades during the chaos. They entered the Tiber, ramming Nektep's supply ships, cutting off his retreat. Carthaginian marines stormed the shores, trapping the invaders between 2 flames, Rome behind them, fire ahead. Nektep fought to the last. He died not in retreat, but at the heart of the Forum, beneath the broken column of Concordia Nova, cut down by a former Egyptian scribe who now fought under a Roman banner. When it was over, Rome still stood, barely. But in its survival, it had become something more. It was no longer the city that resisted empire. It was now the city that endured it. After Nektep's defeat, the world exhaled. The assault on Rome, the final, desperate gamble of a collapsing empire, had failed. And yet, in its failure, it had revealed something profound. Egypt could bleed, its armies could be broken, its myths challenged, its vision eclipsed. The empire that had once seemed eternal now seemed exhausted, like a monument weathered not by storm, but by time. Tiberius Livius, gravely wounded during the siege, was carried through the streets of Rome not as a king, but as a symbol. Children followed, veterans wept, scribes wrote furiously as he dictated his final orders from a stretcher in the Senate hall. He knew this was not the end of a war, but the beginning of a transformation. We did not win because we were stronger, he told the Senate. We won because we remembered what it meant to change. In the months that followed, the Roman Republic solidified into something new. Not merely a city-state or a rebel alliance, but a cultural gravity well. Its language, born of fusion, now spread like wind across the Mediterranean. In Ephesus, temples were rebuilt with amphitheaters attached. In Sicily, trade laws were codified using a mixture of Latin and Phoenician clauses. Even in parts of Anatolia, governors who once swore loyalty to Pharaoh now taught their children republican philosophy beside tales of Osiris. Meanwhile, Thebes fell silent. Khayyam did not speak for weeks after Nektep's death. He wandered the inner sanctum of the Temple of Karnak, barefoot, dressed no longer in gold but in plain linen. Priests reported hearing him whisper to the gods, asking not for victory but for understanding. What did I protect? he asked the high priest of Ra one night. Stone? Memory? Or only my fear of losing them? He knew what was coming. Across Egypt, satrapies declared autonomy. Nubia reclaimed its independence. Alexandria precursor voted to dissolve its temples. Even Memphis, the empire's second heart, began minting its own coinage, bearing not Pharaoh's seal, but a symbol once unthinkable, the wolf and the ankh entwined. Rome did not invade. It didn't have to. It absorbed. Carthage, ever fluid, stepped in to fill power vacuums. But this time, it did not seek to dominate. Instead, it aligned itself more fully with the Roman model, adapting its own oligarchic structure to reflect republican principles. A new senate was created in Carthage. Former rivals were now equals. Rome and Carthage, once distant allies bound by war, became twin centers of a new order, the Mediterranean Concord. Together, they drafted the Treaty of Maat and Memory, a charter that redefined the ancient world. Its articles were simple. No state shall claim divine right over man. All cities may govern themselves, but must teach the shared script of history. War is not holy, it is failure. Temples may stand, but they must be open to question. It was signed not on a battlefield, but beneath the scorched arch of Concordia Nova. Now rebuilt, its ashes swept into the foundation stone. Kayamwaset, aged and thin, traveled there in secret to witness the ceremony. He did not speak. But as Tiberius Livius, gaunt and dying, signed the final parchment, their eyes met across the chamber. A nod, a farewell between two ages. Tiberius died weeks later, entombed not in a golden crypt, but beneath the Senate floor, wrapped not in linen, but in a mantle woven with the free script's first words. The breath of men is not property. Kamwaset returned to Thebes and never ruled again. He spent his remaining years as a teacher, opening a small school on the west bank of the Nile, where he taught astronomy, law, and the dangerous power of memory. His final pupil, a child from a fishing village, would go on to write the first comparative history of the Egyptian and Roman worlds. He titled it Two Sons. By the year 998 BCE, the ancient Egyptian empire, as it had existed, was no more. But its knowledge survived. Its architecture endured. Its symbols, once wielded as weapons of conquest, were now shared as lessons. And in this new Mediterranean world, neither ruled by pharaoh nor consumed by empire, the dream of permanence had been replaced by something far more resilient: adaptation. By the end of the 10th century BCE, the world that had once bent beneath Pharaoh's gaze now flowed in another rhythm, one not ruled by stone, but by shared breath. Empires had risen, clashed, and bled into each other, not as victors and vanquished, but as sediment shaping a new riverbed of civilization. Rome no longer marched as a republic in exile. It had become something more elusive, an idea. It moved not only through soldiers and walls, but through scripts, systems, and symbols. The wolf and the ankh, once opposing emblems, now adorned buildings side by side. Students debated Cicero beside hymns to Thoth. Civic plazas stood in former temple grounds. Markets echoed with 5 languages. It wasn't peace, it was plurality. But every new order must wrestle with its own past. In Thebes, the Nile continued to flood, but not with the same reverence. Where once barks of gold sailed beneath banners of Ra, now modest vessels carried scrolls, goods, and travelers. The priesthood, long the spine of Egyptian power, fractured into sects, some embracing reform, others retreating into fundamentalism. Among them, a new movement emerged: the Sons of Horizon, a spiritual sect born not from rebellion, but from grief. They believed that the Egyptian empire had not failed because of war or politics, but because it forgot its center. They saw the fusion with Rome not as enlightenment, but dilution. The gods do not negotiate, one of their scrolls declared. They shine, or they vanish. At first, the movement was dismissed as fringe, but slowly their message spread. Among rural temples, among old warriors, among those who remembered the golden age of pharaohs with aching nostalgia. They began burning free script scrolls in small towns, protesting mixed script schools, whispering about a second sun that would rise from the desert and restore divine order. Rome was not blind to this. Tiberius Livius's successor, Cassia Marcellus, the Republic's first woman consul, recognized the signs. She was no general, but a scholar of history and psychology. She had studied how empires decayed, not from conquest, but from within, when myth hardened into longing. So she moved gently. Rather than suppressing the sons of Horizon, she invited their leaders to open forums in Alexandria Precursor, now a joint cultural capital governed by a Roman-Egyptian council. She offered them platforms, not prisons, questions, not chains. Some responded. Others vanished into the southern sands. Meanwhile, Carthage expanded its diplomatic reach. No longer satisfied with sea lanes and trade, it established the Council of Islands, a federated body of Mediterranean port cities, Rhodes, Syracuse, Sardinia, Cadiz, all operating under shared legal codes. The council, though nominally neutral, had adopted Roman administrative structure, Carthaginian economics, and even elements of old Egyptian law. A quiet truth had emerged. No one power ruled. Instead, a latticework of influence spanned the sea. Cities cross-pollinated with ideas, populations intermarried, philosophies translated and blended. But this new complexity brought new tensions. Younger generations, raised in a world where Ra and Republic coexisted, began to ask dangerous questions. If all gods are equal, are any sacred? If no city rules, who leads? And if history is written by everyone, does it mean anything at all? The equilibrium wavered. In Athens, a radical philosopher named Thales Heretike published The Mirror of Dust, a treatise arguing that civilization itself was a myth, that Egypt, Rome, Carthage, all were simply masks worn by chaos. He advocated for deurbanization, the return to small tribes, the abandonment of structured governance. His writings spread like wildfire, especially among youth disillusioned with bureaucracy and compromise. The Sons of Horizon found unlikely allies among these anarchists. Together, they staged demonstrations, burned archive houses, and vandalized monuments of unity. The Mediterranean concord, so carefully woven, began to fray. Cassia responded with both brilliance and restraint. She summoned a grand congress, the Assembly of the Three Fires, to be held at Delphi, long a contested symbol of prophecy and rebellion. Every city, every province, every cult and council was invited. Not to settle laws, but to speak truths. To ask, where does this civilization go next? It would be the first time since the dawn of written memory that every voice, from priest to sailor, from scholar to slave, would be represented. As preparations began, a final ship crossed the Aegean. A small vessel, carved in cedar, bearing an aged man cloaked in linen. His eyes were sharp despite the weight of years. His name was once feared by rebels, etched in the blood of temples, inked into decrees of fire. Kayamwaset, long thought dead, now returned, not as prince, not as priest, but as witness. He did not speak when he arrived. He simply sat beneath the olive trees of Delphi and waited. The world had outlived his empire. Now he would see what it became in the ruins of permanence. Delphi had once been a place where gods spoke. Now, in the year 997 BCE, it became a place where people listened. The Assembly of the Three Fires opened beneath thunderclouds. Delegates gathered from every corner of the known world. Egyptian scribes in flowing linen. Roman senators draped in wool and iron. Carthaginian merchants bearing scrolls and coral. Greek philosophers, Phoenician mystics, and even nomads from the western deserts, each carrying languages, myths, grievances, and dreams. But there were no thrones, only a circle of stone benches surrounding a single fire, meant to symbolize neither empire nor deity, but the fragile warmth of cooperation. For 12 days they spoke. not in proclamations, but in questions. A Theban scholar stood and asked, "If Rome endures but forgets the Nile, does it still carry our soul?" A Sicilian farmer asked, "Why do the temples store grain while my village starves?" A woman from Cadiz asked, "When our children speak in 3 tongues but pray to none, what will they become?" No answers were given, only silence, then more questions. And perhaps that was the answer. On the final night, the old man rose. Kayamwaset had remained silent through every session, listening as if trying to measure time itself in words. But now, with the fire flickering low and the winds rising from the mountains, he stepped into the circle. His voice was slow, worn smooth like river stone. "You speak of gods and laws and futures. I once ruled where the sun rose in stone. I saw men kneel because they were told to, and I watched that stone crack, not from war, but from forgetting what it meant to doubt." He looked up at the sky, dark and quiet. "When I was a boy, I was told that memory must be carved, that change is disorder. But the Nile taught me otherwise. It floods, it recedes, and yet it always returns. What you have built, this republic, this concord, this confusion, it is not a failure of civilization." He paused. "It is its beginning." No applause followed, only breath, only the sound of the fire hissing against dew. That night, the assembly did not pass laws, but a new calendar was agreed upon, one that began not with a conquest or a coronation, but with a dialogue. The first year was named Anno Concordiae, Year of the Concord. Across the Mediterranean, changes came not in sudden revolutions, but in slow transformations. In Thebes, temples remained, but their inscriptions were updated yearly with civic oaths. In Rome, citizens celebrated not military victories, but the founding of schools. In Carthage, trade fairs included debates where merchants and philosophers discussed ethics between contracts. Children were taught a new triad: balance, memory, choice. Even the sons of Horizon faded, not through war, but through disinterest. Their certainty could not compete with curiosity. Their fire dimmed beside the quiet brilliance of a world no longer desperate for order, but open to complexity. As for Kayamwaset, he passed away 2 winters later in a small house near the Nile. He left behind no pyramid, no monument, only a scroll titled simply, "Echoes of the First Empire." It ended with one sentence: "If the gods no longer speak, it is not because they are silent, but because they are listening." In this imagined world, where ancient Egypt extended its hand not just across deserts, but across oceans, we witnessed a civilization transform from eternal stone to living idea. A republic born from resistance. A culture shaped by fire, but refined by conversation. And a world where gods were not destroyed, but questioned. What might have happened if Pharaoh had crossed the sea? We saw not just conquest, but convergence. And perhaps the real question is this: would you want to live in that world, where no empire reigns alone, where memory is shared, not dictated, where the future is not inherited, but chosen? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Would the Concorde have survived? Or would it too become another ruin beneath the sands of time? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next alternate history. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more explorations into worlds that almost were.